Hello, hello, hello. We are live. So it's been interesting. The last 2 weeks, our Wednesday webinars have been Thursday webinars. So we're a little bit off so that yesterday everybody could enjoy the celebrations of a new administration and all of that. So today, it's a Thursday, so we know it's a little bit different, but welcome to Making Cancer Fun. And we've got a really interesting conversation today. I'm excited for you guys to meet Punam. And I asked her before we got started, I want to make sure I'm saying her last name right. It's Saxena, right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. She holds a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's in education. And what I really liked about her is not only is she's got her own 4 college-age kids, but she's also taught for 10 years, and then she spent 20 years actually volunteering in her children's school and in their classrooms and working with administrators. And she has, as a result, has really implemented several processes that have benefited lots of children in the school, really with working, advocating the administrators, the school districts, the parents, kind of creating this little triangle to best support a child. And so now she's a parent impact coach. She's the host of the podcast edu-Me, and she will be having her first book come out soon. Her mission is to really bridge the gap and foster a stronger relationship between parents and schools by really empowering the parents to become partners in the school. And she also hosts these monthly webinar series with her EDU school, her edu-Cademy, and they do topics that are relevant to parents in more of like a deep dive so that parents feel like, okay, I have a positive path going forward. And when we were chatting, the thing that really struck me is that as a parent, particularly as a parent who has a child who's either gone through cancer or has some, major medical needs, and maybe the child has been out of school for a long time, and they're trying to transition back, or maybe they have a diagnosis and now it's like, well, how does school look with that happening? There's a tendency that we're already burned out, right? And now we've got to be an advocate that we've been doing in the hospital now in a school setting, and how to kind of ease that transition. And that's where Punam's really an expert. And that's what we're going to talk about today. How do you really kind of create a supportive, I picture this little triangle when you talk, this little, like the school, the district, the administration, the teachers, and the parents, kind of creating this little triangle that best supports a child without feeling frustrated, without feeling like your voice isn't being heard, without also feeling like you just have to go along with whatever the school says, right? So, Punam, I know one of the things that you mentioned when we talked, and this really struck me, is that parenting is a marathon, not a sprint. And when you're going through a cancer treatment, it sure feels like a marathon. And so, kind of share a little bit of your expertise with one of the questions you had posed that I thought was super fascinating is the goals of the parent is maybe not always the goals of the school, and what that looks like, and what does a parent do when those are different? Or maybe a parent's never, for me, I had never even thought about what are my goals for my child going back to school.
I think that, first of all, thank you, Tara, for inviting me. I'm very excited to speak to your audience. And I know that the challenge of having a child go through a health challenge, health scare, can be very daunting in and of itself. And then the other part of the puzzle is that you want your child to stay academically as much on track as possible. And that's a difficult road to navigate at times. Mm-hmm. So what happens is a lot of times teachers are bound by what they have to do. The federal and state mandates really have pigeonholed teachers into a position where they are told how to teach, so that across the district, across the state, most students are taught the same skill on the same day. So, for example, if your child is supposed to learn 2 + 2 on, let's say September 13th, then every single other child in your district and state is learning 2 + 2 on September 13th.
I didn't know that.
That's kind of how they have pigeonholed teachers. And that's one of the reasons teachers find teaching not as enjoyable, is because it's being told to them, versus when you and I went to school, there was some flexibility built in. Now, I know administrators try to do the best they can to provide those flexible slots of time for teachers, but it's still very tough. So think about the teacher's point of view, that they absolutely are bound to this schedule. Now you're bringing a child in who maybe has been out of school, out of academic learning for X number of days or months. Now we're playing catch up. The one thing that I will say is, whatever you choose to do, your child is your child, and you know your child best, and you have to advocate for them. It may be that they need to take additional time out of the classroom, and where you're able to just catch them up, or you hire a tutor. But when I had parents come into those IEP meetings, and as you can imagine, I imagined, I wasn't a parent at the time, that these professionals are sitting at the table and they're telling you what your child's goals are. Well, I see Susie doing this, and this is what we need to do for the next year. That's great. But at the end of the day, when they graduate from high school, they're your child, and your goals and the school's goals have to align.
So that's an interesting concept. I guess in your experience, what are some of the goals that you've seen that parents want for their children that maybe the school hasn't even thought of, or that's not the school goal? Like, can you give some examples of where that might look different?
So we have to remember what and how schools are funded, right? They're funded by money. They grow off of money. They provide services off of the funds they get. So they're looking at those standardized test scores, the state testing that every child is supposed to take. That's how they're gaining their funds. So they're wanting to push those academics as hard as they can. And there's nothing wrong with that. We all need our children to have some level of mastery of some skills as they head out into the world. But if your child needs social skills or emotional support, those need to also be in your child's IEP. Because again, when they go to graduate at the age of, 18, 19, 20 at times, what does that look like for them? They're going to need to know the academic part of it, but they're also going to need to know the social and emotional part of it, how to take care of themselves. And so when you have children who have struggled through their life with cancer, they're already ahead of the 8 ball in terms of being able to take care of themselves. They're strong. We just have to equip them with the skills.
So how do you have that conversation as a parent? Because I feel like this happens often. We talk about this in the hospital, right? Like, a parent wants to do one thing, the medical professionals want to do something else. And there's often this kind of like power struggle, right, between the parents. And now we have this in the school. And so you've got an administration saying, well, this is what we want you to do, or the IEP saying this is what you want to do, and a parent going, well, I don't really know if that works best for my kid. So how can a parent kind of position themselves so that they're being heard? They're not just coming across as aggressive or confrontational, particularly given the concept that for a lot of parents, you're just tired of the fight, right? You're just tired of having to constantly feel like, okay, my voice isn't being heard. This is my kid. Because what I heard you say before, and I think that this so resonates with me, is that you know your child best. Yeah. Right? Even better than the person who sat down and tested them for 10 hours or whatever, because you're with that kid all the time. And so, do you have some tips or language, or how parents can really position themselves so that ultimately their voices are heard and they're not putting the person they're sitting across from on the defensive?
Sure. So, teachers and administrators are there to ensure our children get what they need, the support that they need. So, what we need to do as parents is ensure that we are building a relationship with our teachers and administrators. I think that's the key across the board. You do that with your physicians and your nurses so that when there is an issue, you can just pick up the phone and go, I need to speak with the nurse, and they know you, they understand where you're coming from, and you're not seen as that imposing figure. Let's just transfer that over into education. It's the same process. You want to build those connections with your child's teacher, A, so that you know what's going on in their classrooms, but also B, that if there is an issue or a concern, that your teacher and administrator understands where you're coming from and that you're not being that bully in the meeting.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is really that they're making sure that the only time that you're not only showing up when there's a problem, right? So
Yeah.
what might that look like for a parent, particularly given the fact that, a lot of parents, they're trying to maybe transition back to work. There's financial stress, of course, that comes with any kind of major medical, diagnosis or illness. They don't maybe have the time to volunteer, or they might just be trying to hold it together, so they're probably not going to take on the PTA president mom or concert mom and stuff. So what might that look like on a way that feels manageable?
The most manageable way to do that is to communicate via email. You're sitting at your computer.
Okay.
When you're transitioning from one activity to another at work, just shoot an email off and go, I want to make sure that Johnny's having a good day. Wanted to check in with you. What I used to do with my children is, and I happen to have the contact information for my children's teachers, is I would shoot them a text and go, so-and-so had a rough morning, and I just want you to have a heads up.
That's so simple.
And it's so easy. We're on our phones all the time anyway. Why not use it for our children's benefit? And usually after first period, we'd get a text going, all is well. It was a good class. They were involved. They were paying attention. That's all I needed to know. But it helped the teacher understand that if there was an issue, to kind of give them some slack, because when we don't communicate, even in simple ways, some behavior may be misconstrued by the teacher, and we don't want that, especially if our child is struggling.
That's a really good point. I think as a parent, I would feel like, I don't want to bother the teacher. I don't want to text the teacher. I don't want to let her know every little thing, right? But it could be that maybe there was an issue today. They had to take medication that they didn't want, or maybe there was a frustration over, I couldn't do what I normally would do getting ready because they're still recuperating medically. I mean, it could be a wide variety of issues, right? And so that's interesting to really say to a parent, like, have the freedom to give that teacher the heads up and not feel like you're bothering them. Because that's how I would feel. I'd feel like, oh my gosh, I'm this parent again who's texting the teacher. She's going to be like, she texts me over every little thing, right? But that's not really what I'm hearing from you.
I never, in my 20 years of having children in school, and I'm talking from preschool all the way through high school, I never had a teacher say, I don't want to know what's going on. Not once. And maybe, and you know what, if they did, then they never shared it. And it's easy for the teacher to say, okay, well, that parent is a hypochondriac and they're overreacting. Okay, maybe. But what happens when that one day that you contacted them and they're like, oh my gosh, thank you for letting me know, because the behavior I was seeing in class was so atypical of what I see.
Interesting.
Right? So we have to be I think that communication line has to stay open, and it has to stay respectful. It can't be, you did this to my child, and so now we have an issue. It has to be a dialogue. And the other thing that I will say here is, if there is a challenge and you have a disagreement with the teacher or administration, create a solution for them. Help them understand what's going on, I'm not saying to sidestep the concern, share the concern, but then have some options of what you all can do to make it better going forward. Because I think teachers and administrators feel threatened when they're only brought with concerns and not solutions.
So that's interesting. Even coming up with like, what would you like that to look like for your child? You kind of remind me when Emily started kindergarten. And I don't know if this is true for all children who go through cancer. We had extenuating circumstances because Emily was going through like a crazy divorce situation while she was going through cancer. So there were some very severe attachment issues. And all kids, right, when they go to kindergarten, they're crying. Not all kids. Some kids are like, bye, mom, I'm having fun. It's the mom who's crying, right? But there are a lot of kids who don't want to be separated from their parents at that kindergarten. And so we really struggled with, not only was it this like, oh my gosh, I can't leave my mom attachment issue, but it really didn't ease. You know, most children after a little bit, they're good. You know, Emily's lingered longer than maybe another child would have. And even after she started to do well, if there was a substitute teacher, it was havoc. I mean, just this would turn her world upside down, hysterics and everything. So we got to the point where, very similar, like, okay, this is not working if there's a substitute, right? And so the solution became, and openly, I don't remember if I came up with a solution or they came up with a solution, that if there was going to be a substitute ahead of time, and they knew, we were told ahead of time, and she was able to prepare. And if it was a last minute substitution, they still notified me that morning. And then I could choose whether or not even to send her to school that day or how to handle that, and being prepared and not showing up and finding out like, oh, this is a strange face I wasn't expected. So something simple like that, you know, which obviously they didn't do for every child. They didn't tell everybody, hey, there's a substitute today, right?
Right.
But coming up with a solution. So I think as a parent thinking, since we do know our child best, if there is something that's not working, thinking what would work for my child, knowing my child, what would work for me, what would I like them to do? And then maybe even coming up with like 2 or 3 options and saying, you know, a term that I learned in the hospital that I wish I had learned early on. And this was like, I did not learn this, so I cannot say it worked. Now that I have, it has served me well. There's a phrase that I use all the time now when there seems to be a little bit of a conflict in the medical. And I always say, does it seem reasonable to?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so I'll be like, well, do you think it might be reasonable to try this instead, or to go do that instead? It's very hard to be like, no, that's not reasonable, right? And so I'm wondering if that would also work in the school setting, to say, you know, would it be reasonable that if you knew there was a substitute teacher coming in, you could give me a heads up so I could prepare my daughter? You know, would it be reasonable to be able to get a text on that morning? I have found that for whatever reason, that term really diffuses any kind of conflict, and people seem very open to that. It has served me very well. And I feel like that would work in the school system. So again, going off that, you know what your kid needs best. One of the things that, again, we had chatted with before that I felt like, oh, I really get this. I saw this when we put Emily on so when she went into school, she went on a IEP. And I do think that a lot of these children returning from school, if they have a severe medical diagnosis, go on to an IEP, even if there's not necessarily learning issues, there's, you know, health impacted issues, and maybe need OT services or speech services or whatever it is. And it's interesting because there's a lot of people who are very concerned about putting their child on an IEP because of the labels that they're going to have. Or you and I were talking about, you know, you have a child who's gone through all this emotional, you know, medical trauma, and maybe they're a little disruptive in class. And now they're getting labeled as disruptive. And so it's now going to follow them, right? The next teacher's like, oh, that's the one that's the trouble in the class. And as parents, we get nervous. We don't want our children labeled, particularly in a case like this, right? Where this is a child who is going through an extenuating circumstance, right? And the flip side was I was also nervous, like, well, I don't want them to constantly give her exceptions and think that she's not smart enough or she can't keep up academically. And they'll just be like, oh, well, poor Em, she had cancer. We'll just let her, you know what I mean? So how do you balance that with the school and expectations? And, you know, that's a totally foreign area for me.
I think it goes back to communicating. But part of it is when we label children, and this is my difficulty with labeling children, whether they have, an extenuating circumstance due to medical or a physical disability, or, let's go the other spectrum that they're gifted, right?
Yeah.
We put those labels on, and then that's what our expectation becomes. So there's nothing wrong with a child having an IP or a 504 and needing assistance. The challenge becomes, how long will that label last? And how does that label affect the self-confidence of the child?
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, if they feel like they have a learning disability, then they're going to have a learning disability. If they have dyslexia, which is more a brain function, then they're constantly going to be looking at every reading material with apprehension instead of, so I have this and this is my coping mechanism and this is how I'm going to handle it. So I think we have to be very careful. The other positive part of labeling is that it allows us to understand what the challenge is and to address it effectively. You don't want someone who has profound dyslexia to be in a regular reading class because they're not going to succeed. So you want to make sure your children are in a classroom that is successful for them, that they're in a positive learning environment. So this is the catch-22 when it comes to IEPs and 504s. Now, I can say that when my children were in high school, it seemed like everybody had a 504 for
Really?
testing accommodations. I mean, there was some absurd, percentage. And well, think about what happens in high school. We have calculus tests, we have algebra tests, we have, literature tests. They're very intense type of assessments. We also have standardized testing, state mandated testing that determines whether you're promoted or you graduate. So there's some high stakes testing that's happening in high school. So think about, the parent does want more time for their
That's so
child
interesting.
if they need it. But so much of that when they get to high school has already been vetted out that they really don't need it. It's just there in case.
That's very interesting because I was talking to a friend of mine who's very well versed in the childhood cancer world. She has an older survivor, and it's just a very brilliant woman. And so she really encouraged me to do some neuropsych testing. And there's plenty of evidence that supports late effects for children from their chemo and stuff, and how that affects their brain functioning and their executive functioning and stuff. And it was interesting. Our particular hospital didn't necessarily make that as a mandate. I know some children's hospitals, as they transfer to the survivors clinic, they do. So I had to request that. And I'm really glad that I did, because part of what came out of that is that untimed testing really would best support her. And that's not something that I would have thought about. And the exact point that you make, when she was younger, she didn't want to do the untimed testing because then she had to go into a special room with special kids. And it's so interesting how at a young age, children really they label each other, right? That's the smart kid. That's the dumb kid. Like it's very heartbreaking, actually. And so she didn't want to be in that room with those kids for her state testing. But those tests did not carry the same weight in the long-term impact in her life that something potentially like like an AP test or a SAT or a GRE may carry. And so I was like, for those tests, hey, if you can get that extra time, why would you not take advantage of that, right? Particularly because these kids already have so many mountains to climb. Why give yourself another one? But you're right. It's this very fine line of and I hear this over and over again from cancer survivors, they just want to feel normal. They don't want to feel different. They don't want to be made to feel different. And so she did everything she could to get off that IEP, that didn't want to get pulled out, didn't want to be made to feel different. Like it was this desperation to just feel normal. And maybe that's, I have no basis if that's more or less in the childhood cancer community than any kid who just wants to feel normal and doesn't want to feel labeled. And I think, and parents, hearing from parents who are very afraid to have their child labeled.
Well, because in social settings, what happens, right? Oh, your child is in that classroom. So I'll give you an example. I have 4 adult children, like you said, and one of my children did not do well on one of the reading state standardized testing. And when I say didn't do well, like he made the average cut. He wasn't above average, he wasn't below, he was, right in the middle. And the principal wanted to put him in a special classroom for the next year for reading. And I went in and I said, I disagree with you. I feel like that's going to diminish his self-confidence, and we're not going to see the results that maybe you're thinking you're going to see. And she said, listen, this is a rule for every single child in the school that has this score. So this is how it's going to be. And she and I went back and forth for a couple of weeks before school started, because I was like adamant that my child was not going to be in this classroom. And
what was your concern about that? What was your concern about having him in a different classroom?
Because even though he wasn't a strong reader, he wasn't a low reader, if that makes sense. He wasn't a struggling reader. He was able to read. But, I succumbed. She's the principal. But it was on record that I was against this. And I watched him every single day for that school year. And in April of that school year, I went into her and I said, I owe you an apology. I said,
wow,
his comprehension, his ability to read, his, I can't think of the word that I want to say. The reading speed had improved. So she was absolutely right. And so I went in and I apologized to her. And I said, you were right. I apologize. But, that's how you build trust. I went in.
Yeah, right. Being able to say, I'm right, I'm wrong. I mean, that's like in any relationship outside of this, in friendships and in marriage, like that's how, right? Being able to say, hey, I was wrong. So.
And I think that's how you gain credibility as a parent. It's saying, you know what, my child is human. They're not perfect. Here we go. But we parents put a lot of pressure on ourselves to be perfect. And we want our children, especially cancer children who have had cancer, we want them to be as normal as possible.
Yeah.
And yet we don't know what normal is because we haven't been there. So
it's such an interesting, in the cancer community, I feel like there's this very strong like scale. So I either see parents that, and I've been on both sides of the scale at different times. So that's why I can say this. There's times when you're like, my child is the exception, right? Like you need to see my child differently, treat my child differently. You have no idea what this kid and what our family has gone through. And I need all of these special circumstances given what we're going through and what this kid has gone through. And then there's the whole other end, which is just I want my child to be normal. I don't want cancer to take anything else from them. I want them to, I'm so like, it was like when Emily had her hearing aids. To me, that was so devastating, which in retrospect seems so silly, but it was such now this is going to be forever. And I just want to be done with this season. And so I think it's always this kind of coming from these extremes, and how do you kind of find a middle ground,
I think that middle ground comes when you see your child succeed in whatever avenue they are. And again, think about the way we respond to things. Some days if we haven't had enough sleep, and we're tired, we're going to react totally different.
Mhm.
We're going to be maybe grouchy, and I call it Oscar the Grouch in our home because, you didn't get enough sleep or food or whatever. And then there are days that are just fantastic, right? Everyone's excited. You feel like you can conquer anything. Our children feel the same way. And so it's that, and my husband calls it it's a moving target. You never know where you're going to land.
Mm.
But it's important to realize that even children who are having a medical situation, they're going to have their good days and bad days regardless of whether they're home or in their
Yeah.
hospital or at school. So we just have to be able to navigate that and be flexible. And we need to make sure that our teachers are flexible as well. And we can only help them understand what's going on by communicating with them. And I always go back to communicating because that's the crux of every single relationship that we ever develop. And our teachers spend a tremendous amount of time with our children. They deserve that relationship and that communication just as much as anyone else.
Yeah, and I think it depends where you are on your cancer journey too. Like a child is just coming right back back into school, right? The school's going to be aware. They know the child's been at school. There's a whole like, okay, how can we help? For the most part, what I've heard and what I experience is how can we help transition this, right? What's been interesting is as my daughter's gotten older and moved into a middle school and then into a high school with people and teachers that really don't know her history, and needing to make sure that they still had a heads up, because that I'm thinking even might be, when we're talking about with the heads up of the teacher, you might have a kid who's a few years out of treatment, but they have to go in and every year and get their work there up, and maybe it's every 6 months or it's every year or even every 3 months, whatever. And I'm just thinking, I just know as a parent, right, that week before you feel anxious, you feel stressed. And for an older kid who's maybe in high school or middle school and really understands what these tests mean, right? Versus like, or even, your 6-year-old may not know they're going back to the hospital, right? That might not be information that you're telling them, where your 13-year-old is going to know. And so even that week before, their behavior at school might seem off, or they might be having a hard time focusing, or they might not be getting their work done. And even just giving the teacher the heads up and saying, hey, we're going in for our, quarterly scans or our biannual scans. I just wanted to give you a heads up. I don't know if this is going to be affecting, her schoolwork, but you may see her a little distracted. Things like that. The other thing we had is that when we first went back to school, Emily was out about once a month, and we were able to write into her IEP like that her absences were not an issue. And even things like, I had said to them, hey, if she's sleeping in the morning and she's tired, I'm not bringing her in. I will bring her in when she wakes up because, of all the stuff that was going on. And fortunately, we had an environment where the school was very willing to write all of that into the IEP. But when when kids, particularly when they're little, right, and kids are out of school and then they go back, everybody's like, where were you? Right. And so that became a little bit of an issue as she got older. She didn't want kids to constantly know she had to go to the hospital or she was going here. And so even kind of communicating to the teacher, hey, this is where we're going.
Right.
But that's not what she's going to, necessarily tell the class. Although we did have a really funny instance. So anybody who follows Making Cancer Fun, you guys know I'm all about how fun can we make this. So every time we would go to the hospital, even through our checkups, we would do a theme and we would get dressed up in costumes, and she would have party favors and we would hand those out. And she was in first grade and she had to go to it was 2 days at the hospital for all sorts of follow-up visits, whatever we were doing at the time. And so I had given the teacher the heads up. I said, we're going to be out. She's going to go to the hospital for 2 days. So she gets back into school, and the kids at school, of course, are like, oh, Emily, where were you for 2 days? As kids are, right? And she's like, oh, I went to this party with my mom. She wasn't doing it to be deceitful. She wasn't doing it because she didn't want them to know the hospital. In her mind, we had a party for 2 days. Like, we celebrated, we went out to dinner. So the teacher actually calls me and she's like, Miss Scary, I have a question. She's like, you told me Emily was going to the hospital. She told me a little something different. She told me you actually took her to like a party. And I was like, oh, actually, no, she was in the hospital, but she views it as a party.
Right. Well, and
um,
it's all in our approach, right?
yeah,
How are we going to make it um, fun for our children and not so scary? And yet, the underlying theme, I mean, if they're going to the hospital, they know why they're going,
yeah,
right? And so I think one of the things, and it depends on the child, but I can even see a child who's very comfortable with having been to the hospital coming back and saying, you know what, they took my blood pressure, they took all this blood, like I had all these vials lined up, they stuck me in this tunnel and did all these scans, where people can, where the other children can maybe learn about the medical part of what's going on and begin to empathize and sympathize. The next
that's an
time
interesting point.
Emily goes to the hospital, they're like, oh my gosh, are you going to have to go in that tunnel again? Like, do you have to just stay there? So there's an
Yeah,
opportunity for learning and growth as well for other students. Now, I don't think that's the answer for every single child who's going through cancer, because I don't, it depends. You don't want misinformation going out
yeah.
there either.
Well, and I
But
think it depends how private the child is and how private the family is. But you bring up a very good point. Again, you know your child best. Is it better for the kids at school to know what's going on, or is it better for them not to? And if you don't want them to, if the kid is very like, I want to keep this private, then can you and the teacher, again, going back to what you said before, can you guys come up with a solution of how would you like to address this so that everybody's on the same page? The teacher knows this is what she's telling the kids. I'm going to make sure I don't mention anything to the kids so that everybody feels like, we're supporting this child in the way that they need to be supported. And what works for one family may not work for another
right.
family,
And,
um,
and HIPAA is an issue, of course, but a lot of kids are curious. Most kids are
mhm.
curious, right? They're inquisitive. Oh, Emily, you went to a party? What did you do at your party for
Right.
2 days? Right? Well, they took, I mean, I'm making this up, 10 vials of blood, and, the caps were green and purple and yellow, like it can be a conversation where only if the child and the family are comfortable with that.
Yeah.
But
And I think that depends on the age of the child too. And as far as what they want to know and things like that. Um,
and the
and
severity, right? Because a lot of children who are going through severe medical challenges really don't want to talk about it because they're
yeah,
living it day in and day out. So it's
yeah,
a case
that's
by
over and
case
over
basis,
again.
but there is an opportunity to educate others, and I think what that does is it allows your child to feel validated, and it allows the other students to go, oh, so that's so how does that happen? Or why does that happen? Why do you have to do this twice a year or 3 times a year? What does that mean?
Yeah. And again, it's everybody has such, even though they're all these childhood cancer in this community, right? I hear such varying experiences. I've heard parents who the school was super supportive, the kids rallied around this child, did all of these things to welcome them back. And then I've also heard of children being extremely bullied in their school. And I mean, things that I can't even repeat on this webinar that have been said to children that just make my heart hurt on such a very deep level that it's horrifying that a child can be so mean to another child. I will say that if you have a kid who's transitioning back to school, we do have a webinar that I did with a Karen O'Reilly, who she has worked for like decades working with childhood cancer families. I think it was out of Sloan Kettering, I want to say. And she is on our YouTube station, and she has a whole program on how to help children transition back to school, including how to set up those IEPs and what to be asking for. It's a very valuable webinar. She used to present it all over the place and came and presented it for our community. So if this is a conversation that you're kind of struggling with or not sure how to get your child back to school and you want to be positive, you can check out that video. I think the big thing I'm getting from you, Punam, is that the conversation needs to be a two-way conversation. And just like we talk about that, it's tough when you're in the hospital and you're trying to advocate, because sometimes it can feel like a tennis match where you're playing, it's the doctor on one side and you're on the other side, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I always try to talk about that. You guys are playing doubles tennis. It's the disease and you guys are on the same team
Right.
playing against the disease, right? And trying to figure out how do you play best together. And that's that same image I'm getting as you're talking about this, is that we can feel like it's us and we're advocating for our kids, and there's the school and the administration and the teacher and what they want to do. And that ultimately, and of course there's always going to be the exception, right? But the majority of teachers, they went into teaching because they want to help children. Right? Like they actually are on your child's side. They want your child to learn. They don't want your child to be disruptive in class. They want everybody to have an easy transition. And you guys are playing doubles tennis on this is the child needs to learn. How do we partner together to make this environment work? And I love your ideas of saying to the teacher, do you want me to email you? Do you want me to text you? Do you want me to give you the heads up? Let's come up with strategies together. What do you think? And keeping that communication open. And then also, that when the teacher or the administration or the school does something that's really working well, affirming them and saying, thank you for this, because we know all of us thrive on positive reinforcement, right? So I can't imagine the party that principal had when you left after saying like, hey, you were right. She was probably like, I'm bringing out the champagne because you affirmed her, right? And that, and it didn't make you less. It was like, hey, I was trying to advocate for my kid, and that's tough, right? Because educators feel like, I went to school, I learned this information, like I know what I'm talking about, the same way a doctor does, where you're like, but it's my kid and I know my kid.
Well, and that's the biggest challenge I think parents feel in general, is that, they're the professionals, they're the doctors, and they're the teachers and administrators, they have the knowledge. But what we have as our advantage is we know our child. We know what they're capable of. We know what our expectations of them are. And it really needs to be homogenous when they go to school. And I want to go back, if you don't mind, for just a moment, because you said something very important and very heartbreaking about bullying. And bullying is such a rampant behavior that we're seeing in our children, in our schools right now. But I want to remind parents, when someone is bullying you, and this is coming from someone who is of Indian descent, who was raised in rural Georgia. So I get it. We were the only Indians in our community for the first 12 years. So we lived here in the 1970s, right after, desegregation. So I totally get the whole bullying thing. I've been there. But I want to remind you that it doesn't speak about your child. It speaks about that person who is doing it. And as hard as it is to hear what that person is saying, it is more important to lift your child up and say, I would like for you to feel sorry for that person, because they don't have enough compassion and understanding of your situation to help you. And that's what we can do, is empower our own children. We can't obviously change anyone else's, but we can lift our own up and say, if you're not liking that, then A, don't do that to somebody else. And B, realize that it's a reflection of them.
And I do think it's hard because kids are like, we don't even do that as adults, right? Like we can't even do that as adults.
Some of us do, but
I do think that it's also important, and this goes back to if you've built that relationship with the school and you've built that relationship with the teacher, just even giving them a heads up, because maybe that's not a great kid for them to be partnered with, or that may not be the right kid for them to be sitting next to. And, I think sometimes we're afraid it's going to go down this, I don't want to open up this, Pandora's box. However, if you've built the relationship, it might be a simple conversation of, hey, I don't want to open Pandora's box on this. I don't want to make this a big deal, but I do want to give you a heads up. This is a few things that I've heard. And can you just make sure that they're not sitting together? They're not partnered together. I just don't want this to exasperate, The
other thing that happens that I would add on to that is you want to have that conversation privately. You don't want any other ears in on that conversation. You don't want your child to hear that. You don't want other students to hear that, and particularly other parents. So it has to be a private conversation. And one of the biggest challenges I think we face as parents when we have a challenge like that is that we want to talk to another parent.
Yeah, that's probably not
going
to get very far.
who has a mutual relationship, whose child has a mutual relationship with that student. That's counterproductive. As hard as it is, I would encourage you not to do that,
Yeah.
because you don't want to taint someone else's relationship. And the other thing is it diminishes really what you're trying to solve. And that is to build your child up, to create distance between you and that other student. And you have to remember that's someone else's child. And maybe they're doing the best they can, and that's the way it is for the moment. And the child's having their own challenges at home, own personal challenges.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to be very cognizant of how we share our concerns.
Yeah.
Share your accolades from the rooftop and your concerns in a very closed environment.
I think that's really great, important advice. Yeah, because you don't want to be the gossip train, right? Nobody needs that. So, well, I really appreciate so much for you coming on and sharing your expertise. And if you guys are like, I like this conversation, or maybe you have other people, it doesn't need to be cancer, right? It could be any kid who's going with school. I mean, schools, particularly this year, right? But depending on where you live in the country, even everybody's having such a different school experience. And Punam does do the podcast. Again, it's called edu-Me. So like education-me. And so you can go in, she hosts a monthly webinar series, and these are all different kinds of topics that really are about advocating and partnering with the schools and what she's learned in both her professional background, but then also what I think is unique about your background is that you have both. You have the mom of the 4-kid background and then the professional background, so you can really see both sides. And I will put in the comments all the links of where to find her, how to connect with her, how to follow her on Facebook or Instagram or any of those other places. But I just so appreciate you being on here today. And I've really enjoyed getting to know you and where your heart is. And it's just a beautiful, friendship that I feel is developing out of our conversations that have had nothing to do with school or childhood cancer. But it's been really, really fun getting to know you. And do you have anything else that you just want to share with share with our community before you go?
Well, first, I'd like to say thank you. I feel the same way. I love our conversations, and they're always part of learning for me and meeting people is trying to understand what their evolution has been and how they get to where they are. And I think that's where you and I connect so well, is that we're all on this journey, but we all are intertwined in the same process.
Yeah.
So how do we get there? And so I'm loving the conversations, and I appreciate your time today. And my last piece of advice is just be patient with yourself. You've had a child go through a traumatic experience. You've gone through a traumatic experience as a parent. You're navigating not only taking care of your child, but trying to deal with your own challenges, your own emotional challenges of having been through it. So be patient. The education part is going to come.
Yeah.
I promise you. I say this all the time. We all learn at different times and spaces, and not all. And I'm going to say this, and I'm going to get slapped by some education guru, but I'm going to say it anyway. Education happens in many different ways, and it's not always in a textbook, and it's not always in a classroom.
That's so valid.
Keep that in mind. If your child's not on grade level or they're struggling, it's okay. I promise you it's okay.
Yeah. And seriously, when you're in the cancer world, that is the last thing you need to be stressing about.
Absolutely. If your child is behind, it's not going to matter one iota when your child is dealing with everything that they're having to deal with. Your job should be to lift them up, keep them strong, and keep them happy.
Yeah.
And the education part will come.
I love that. That is such a great way to end today. So thank you guys so much for watching. Give me a few minutes, because once we end, I will go ahead and put those in the comments, and then we will see you next week. Bye, guys.